Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, Using Student Rate Improvement Data for SLD Evaluation and Eligibility Determination. My name is Ginger Miller and I am a project coordinator at the Effective Evaluation Resource Center. And the EERC is hosting today's webinar. Really quickly, I'm going to take you on a tour of our Elluminate Classroom. To start off, if my voice is really loud or really quiet, you can adjust your volume in the lower left-hand corner where the speaker icon is and turn it up by moving that bar to the right or turn it down to the left. You can also adjust the volume on your own computer if it's still not adjusting properly within Elluminate. So hopefully you can all hear me just fine. If you look up at the upper left-hand corner, that's the participants window. And that's listing just everyone who's here today and your privileges. Today, your privilege that you'll be able to use is the chat feature, and it's shown to you by that little icon that looks like a speaking bubble. The microphone and the whiteboard and the other features will be utilized by the moderators today, which are myself and our presenter. So don't worry about getting your microphone function working because you won't need it today. And then probably most importantly, to the right is the whiteboard, and that will display today's presentation slides. Okay, so we talked about the participants window. Some features you'll be able to use are the chat, and then also at the bottom of your participant window are some emoticons, a smiley face, a confused face, clapping, and a thumbs down. So when you click on those at the bottom, it will show what you're feeling in the participant window. So go ahead and give it a try. Click on your clapping or your smiley face, and there we go, show us some emotion. So through the presentation, if you really like something, you can clap or smile, or if you're a little confused, you can hit the confused face. Great. Okay, the other spot we're going to be allowing you to communicate with us. Oh, wow, look at all that. You can also raise hands. I see some people trying that out too. Super. And then the polling, there's a check for yes and an X for no, and I'm not sure if our presenter is going to want to use that or not, but if she asks you a yes-no question, that's a way for us to get a quick poll of how our participants are feeling. Okay. The other feature we're going to use is the chat window, and some of you, before we started, we saw were able to catch up with each other through the chat feature, which is great. So if you're sending a message to everyone, you would select all rooms and then type in the box and hit send. And if you're sending a message just to myself and the presenter, we're the moderators, so that would just be for our eyes to see. And if you're sending personal messages to each other, that's fine. Just keep in mind there's a little eyeball in the corner, and that just means the moderators see all the chats, and that's just a feature of Elluminate. We really can't help that. So Big Brother's watching. We can see all the chats going on. Okay. So why don't we go ahead and try out the chat feature. Please type your professional role in the chat box so we can just get a sense of who's all here with us today. Okay, I see some school psychologists, lots of school psychologists, special education teacher. We have an intern with us today, a whole RTI team. Dean of Special Education Students, more school psychologists, special ed coordinators, school psychology graduate students. We have some directors of special ed, school psychologists, administrators, some doc students, special ed teachers. All right, look at all of our participants. Okay, and when you're sharing out with the whole group, make sure it's set on all rooms so then everyone can see your chat messages. When you send it just to the moderators, other participants can't see what you're sending. Okay, Director of Exceptional Learners, the School Psychology Intern. Awesome. All right, thank you for sharing. We have a great group today, it looks like. Okay, I just want to take a moment to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Carrie Ball. And Dr. Carrie Ball is an assistant professor of school psychology at Indiana State University. She completed her doctoral training in school psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2008. Her research interests include academic assessment and intervention within response to intervention service delivery models, improved measurement practices to promote data-based decision-making, and system-level factors influencing RTI implementation. She is a licensed school psychologist and a psychologist in the state of Indiana and enjoys remaining active in school-based consultation and supervision in addition to continuing postdoctoral clinical experience with children and families. So welcome, Dr. Ball. Let's give her a round of applause. Let's see if we can use our clapping icon here. I see some hands going. Very nice. Wow, what a virtual welcome. Okay, I am going to hand over the presentation slides and microphone to Dr. Ball. Here you go.
All right, thanks very much, Ginger. Thanks very much to everyone for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be here with you and have this opportunity to present. And I'm also pleased to see so many familiar names in the participant window, so welcome back, those of you who I know and have met over the past 3 or 4 years here in Indiana. Now that you're all familiar with the chat feature, please, if you have questions as I present, feel free to type them in the chat window. I will answer those I can get to, but we do have a pretty packed 45 minutes or so here. And so I will do the best to answer them, and the remaining questions will go back to the EERC, and they will answer them after the fact. Okay, so today we're talking about using student rate of improvement data in making SLD determinations. So what we'll do first is just to talk about when it would be appropriate to consider using rate of improvement data in this type of evaluation. Then we'll discuss several logistics of data collection, including setting goals and talking about the number of data points and the kinds of decision rules we want to have in place. And then we'll discuss some options for data analysis and how to actually calculate and use the rate of improvement data. And then we'll have some examples. First of all, we want to address the question of whether we should be using insufficient progress or a pattern of strengths and weaknesses to make a determination about specific learning disabilities. And so there are several factors to consider. And we just urge you to keep in mind that considering SLD is a very high-stakes decision that we are making, and it's different than decisions that we might make using progress monitoring data about intervention effectiveness. So we answer really 2 types of questions with this information. One is the student responding to intervention? And the other is, might the student qualify as having a specific learning disability? And clearly the decision about responding to intervention is a more low-stakes decision that might affect the student's day-to-day instruction, but doesn't have the same implications as considering SLD. So we need to be really careful about how we are using the progress monitoring data. And at this point, I just want to encourage us to remember that the rate of improvement data constitutes really just one piece of the picture when considering SLD. Also, when we consider an SLD evaluation or determination, we want to make sure that we have reliable and valid indicators of performance and progress. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. There are some strengths and weaknesses to the measures we currently have available for monitoring progress and calculating rate of improvement. And so we want to make sure that the indicators and measurements that we're using have appropriate technical properties for making a decision of this importance. In addition to that consideration, RTI needs to be documented in terms of both the intervention and measurement pieces. So when we consider intervention, several questions need to be answered in order to make a decision about whether we're going to use data to document insufficient progress or whether we're going to lean on a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. First of all, can we demonstrate that the interventions that we're using are evidence-based? And in many or even perhaps most districts, the answer to this question will vary depending on the subject area and possibly the grade level. So for example, reading has the most interventions that would be considered quote-unquote evidence-based. And so we're more likely to be able to demonstrate evidence-based with our reading interventions as compared to perhaps math or written language, and probably more likely to document evidence-based intervention at the earlier as opposed to the upper grade levels. So that's one question to consider, is that we need to be using evidence-based interventions and interventions that are matched to students' learning needs. So in some districts there's more or less problem analysis assessment that takes place to ensure that a student is receiving intervention and instruction at the point at which they need it. So for example, are we simply putting everyone into a fluency intervention first and determining whether they make adequate progress, or are we really looking more deeply to make sure that students are getting the intervention in the area in which they most need it? So for example, are we documenting that students in that fluency intervention have adequate word knowledge or decoding skills to participate fully? And finally, can we document treatment integrity? That is, are we monitoring the implementation of the intervention so that we know students are receiving all the elements that make the intervention evidence-based? Are they getting the intervention as often and for as long and with the intensity that we intended? And have we documented the qualifications and training of our interventionists to deliver that intervention? So those are some questions that need to be addressed from the intervention side before we would want to consider using rate of improvement data as a key piece of the SLD determination. If these questions can't be answered to our satisfaction, then it's unclear whether the rate of improvement is related to a learning disability or whether it's related to factors that are characteristic of our intervention. We also want to take into consideration the measurement that we're using. And so we want to ask questions such as, are these measures technically adequate for this developmental level? So some of our measures tend to be better, stronger, or weaker for younger versus older populations. Are the measures adequate in representing what we expect from our student body? And so in some districts, there's a little bit different trajectory of students in comparison to national norms. And so considering both national and local benchmarks, for example, could be an appropriate option. And then are our measures technically adequate to use in making a decision this important? And again, that sometimes changes depending on the grade level of the student or the particular area of learning disability. So if you can answer these questions to your satisfaction regarding both intervention and measurement, then we can consider using rate of improvement data as a piece of the SLD determination. But again, it will only be a piece, and we should have additional data to support our decision, even though that is not the kind of data we're talking about today. If we determine to use rate of improvement or ROI data to make this determination or to use as part of the SLD evaluation, we want to be sure we're setting appropriate goals for students. And what we'll find and what will become clear throughout the presentation is that one of the biggest challenges to using this kind of data is that we really have a lot of inconsistency across the measures we use, across different districts and different grade levels in terms of policy. And so we'll take a look at several different kinds of progress monitoring data and discuss some recommendations for how we can set appropriate goals and how much progress we might be able to expect. So one of the issues we see when we talk about setting goals is the issue of students making more progress in the fall or more progress in the spring. And so when we graph or plot the benchmark data, then we see the line isn't continuous from fall to spring. There's typically a steeper slope in the fall or a steeper slope in the spring. And so one of the questions is how we can set a goal based on that. And so a good recommendation to use is to consider using the annual rate of improvement. So rather than plotting fall, winter, spring as your benchmark line, just plotting fall, spring, and using that rate of improvement. Because we typically see students progress across the whole year, and we consider that with students at risk, they might be able to make more improvement in one semester than another, and that may actually help them to close the gap if we can accelerate progress where the rest of the class might level off in terms of making academic gains. So we want to use the annual rate of improvement for the purpose of setting goals. Then secondly, students at risk tend to make a little bit less progress than students at the benchmark, but we need to consider that they do make progress without intervention. So when we're looking at that student improvement data, it's likely that even without more intensive intervention, the student's slope would go up across the course of the year. But typically what we would see from fall to spring is that in comparison to the benchmark, an at-risk student gap, or the discrepancy between the student's performance and the expected benchmark performance, would widen. Next, effective intervention and adequate response may only partially close the gap, so this is a really important piece to consider. We want to make sure that we're setting ambitious goals so that we will be motivated to deliver the most powerful intervention we are able to, and so the student might make the most progress they are able to make. However, it's important to remember that across 8 weeks or 12 weeks or even across the course of a school year, a student may not totally close the gap between themselves and the benchmark goal. And so we want to consider that when we're setting goals. In some cases, relatively few, but in some cases, a goal that simply maintains the gap or the size of the discrepancy may be a reasonable goal to set for a student. And one example might be a second grader who's reading at about a first grade level. The reason that maintaining the gap in this situation might be appropriate is that progress at second grade and first grade in those very early grades is very rapid. And so to expect a second grader who's already struggling to gain even faster than students at the 50th percentile or above may be somewhat unreasonable. So in those cases, we just want to make sure that we're setting a goal that's reasonable and attainable for the child, but not so low that we're sure they'll be able to meet it. So we want to balance between reasonable and ambitious goals. An ambitious goal would exceed the average amount of progress that students in the class or in the grade level would make and will begin to close the gap. Depending on how far behind the student is and how quickly other students or average peers would progress across the course of the year, fully closing the gap might be unreasonable. So we just need to consider. And as I said, we'll see some examples of this later on. One of the issues we often see is that determining what the expected rate of improvement would be can be different depending on the measures that you're using, and it changes across grade levels. So here we have a side-by-side comparison of Dibble's benchmark goals and AIMSWeb goals using the 50th percentile as the benchmark. You can see that the Dibble's benchmarks and rate of improvements tend to be slightly lower across the course of a year in comparison to AIMSWeb. And so depending on what kind of progress monitoring tool you're using, your recommendations for how a student might gain over their peers to either maintain or to close the gap can fluctuate just depending on the measurement. I'll give you just a second to look at that, and then we'll talk about how we can address this issue, at least in part. One of the common recommendations that's been used across time is this table from Fuchs, Hamlet, Waltz, and German, which was published in 1993. So you can see that's almost 20 years old already. But it's still commonly used. And what we notice is that if we actually look at, see if I can find my pointing feature, if we actually look at these reasonable goals here in this column and then go back and compare to the Dibbles, 2, 1.5, 1, 0.85, We see that it's a little bit fast here, but that it evens out pretty closely, and that Dibbles actually still aligns fairly closely with that Fuchs et al. Recommendation. However, if you're using AIMSWeb, then you might notice that their rates of improvement are significantly higher, and that the difference by the end of grade 6 is 166 words read correctly per minute in comparison to 120 for Dibbles. So there's actually quite a wide spread, so we need to be careful about how we're actually determining goals based upon the measures that we're using. So a general recommendation for how to establish goals tends to be a little bit difficult due to differences in both measures and targets, differences in the rate of progress calculation, differences in measurement point. For example, all of these goals by both Dibbles and AIMSWeb are basically calculated upon a 36-week school year. But if you consider when you're actually administering the fall benchmark and the spring benchmark, you probably don't have 36 weeks of instructional time in between those two data points. So 30 weeks might actually be more realistic in terms of calculating the goal or the rate of improvement for the year. So you may consider these questions when you're calculating your own goals and base them upon your own measurement points to ensure that you're calculating a correct rate of improvement. A possible recommendation here at the bottom of this slide for calculating realistic and ambitious goals. A realistic goal is basically one that would maintain the discrepancy between the student's current performance and the 50th percentile or the benchmark goal. So if you're using Dibbles and your normative peer or your benchmark peer would gain 1.5 words per week across the course of the entire school year, that would be what would be considered a quote-unquote realistic goal for a student at risk. We encourage ambitious goals, which would exceed the average student's progress and would help the student to close the gap. And so just based on the differences in measurement tool, a possible way to calculate this would be the realistic goal plus about 0.5 words correct per minute per week. So if you look here at like the 3rd grade recommendation, a reasonable goal might be 1 word correct per minute per week, and an ambitious goal would then add 0.5 to that. And what that allows the student to do is to gradually close the gap between their own performance and their benchmark peers' performance, recognizing that they may not fully close the gap within the course of the year. This is a graph that's intended to show the issue we talked about at first with regard to calculating the goals. So if we look at the benchmark progress versus rate of improvement, this is for AIMSWeb data in 1st grade, we can see that if you look at this blue line, this plots fall, winter, spring for this data, and you can see that the slope is more shallow in the fall than in the spring. And so if we're looking at student performance as something to be accomplished across the course of the year, it can be confusing to set a goal based on the slope from fall to winter, because if they maintain that slope in the spring, their data point would actually end up somewhere down here. So it's appropriate in most cases to look at the trajectory from fall to spring, which is the red line, and to calculate the annual rate of improvement based on that, which in this case would be calculated at around 1.8 words per minute per week gain. This is a graph that's intended to show what would happen for a student who did not receive intensive intervention. This is the benchmark for AIMSWeb. So they would start about here and follow the red line trajectory throughout the course of the year. The green line is a student who would be at the 10th percentile and would maintain at the 10th percentile from fall to spring. This is the type of slope that you would see. So you can see where the discrepancy here in the fall is large. Without intervention, it continues to grow larger. And so when we set goals, we need to consider that the student would make progress. So we can't consider a flat baseline and then look at progress above that. We do need to consider that the student would likely make progress without intensive intervention. So we need to account for or plan and set goals for progress that would exceed that. So here we have those goals drawn in. The purple line here indicates a reasonable goal, which would just maintain the gap between the normative rate of improvement, the red line, and the student's performance. So on the purple line, then you would see that the student would gain 1.8 words per minute per week, just like the normative peers. And then at the end of the school year, you can see that here at the end, the gap is just the same as it was at the beginning, but much, much smaller than it would have been if the student had not made progress. If we set an ambitious goal, which you can see at the top is calculated as 1.8 words per minute per week plus 0.5, which would be 2.3 words per minute per week gained, the student will actually succeed in catching up with peers somewhere around week 20 up here. And so in this case, setting an ambitious goal does in fact close the gap fully over the course of the year, and that's the type of goal we would recommend to drive intervention and set our sights high. One comment about this that we'll talk about in a few minutes when we talk about interpreting the data is that it's typically not appropriate if the student makes progress but does not meet the goal line. That's not necessarily indicative of specific learning disability if they have made progress in excess of what you would expect without intervention. And so that's something also to consider and to quantify in terms of making an SLD evaluation or determination. So we'll talk about that in a few minutes. With regard to determining the time frame required for intervention, one thing that's important to consider is the number of data points that's required to make a reliable decision. The common recommendation over the past several years has been that about 8 to 12 progress monitoring data points are needed. There's actually some emerging research that closer to 20 data points are needed to calculate a slope of improvement or a rate of improvement with a reliability of 0.80. which approaches the reliability that you would want to see out of a measurement tool when used in a high-stakes decision. If we collect only about 8 to 12 data points, we see that the reliability really isn't high enough because the error in each data point and in the slope really is too high. The same research that suggests 20 data points also suggests that just simply calculating the slope based on a median of 3 baseline points and a median of 3 endpoint points appears almost as reliable. So if you have 20 weeks worth of data at 1 data point per week, the slope that you get from calculating the rate of improvement off of that in comparison to just plotting a slope based upon a pre-post kind of comparison using 3 measurement points at the beginning and the end of intervention, the reliability appears similar at this point based upon the measures that we have available, such as DIBELS and AIMSWeb. So that's something to keep in mind, that we definitely need to be really careful about the amount of data that we have available for making this decision. And again, to emphasize that if we don't have that amount of data, that rate of improvement is something that can be used cautiously to inform the SLD determination, but should not be used in isolation. And again, it's just one piece of the puzzle. Another point of discussion is the frequency of data collection. Are we going to collect a data point once every week, twice a week, once every 2 weeks? How long before we expect to see improvement? So if the gap is really large between what the student is doing now and what we expect them to be doing, might we wait quite a few weeks before we see any improvement in those data? And then how sensitive is our measure to small changes? So one thing to consider might be, if we're using oral reading fluency, for example, then if the student has deficits, for example, in decoding, and we're targeting decoding skills, is it possible that our oral reading fluency measure won't be sensitive to changes in decoding skills for several weeks? Additionally, we want to consider the size of the gap so that between the student's current performance and the expected performance. Again, this can impact how much time might pass or how much time might be needed before we can see a noticeable change in the size of the gap or in the amount of improvement the student is making in comparison to normative peers. So this should be discussed before using ROI information. Decision rules should be decided at the district or the school or the building team level before intervention is put in place to avoid some of these questions about what if this or what if that as the intervention is in progress. So as much as possible, problem solving and troubleshooting in advance is helpful. So we want to clearly state the expected rate of improvement, which can be calculated based upon the appropriate goals and ambitious goals that we discussed previously. It's also a good idea to specify both the timeline for seeing intervention effects and the number of data points required. And by specifying both of these things, it allows us to work around things like frequent absences or situations where the student doesn't show up or the intervention can't be implemented. So by specifying how many intervention sessions will be needed before we'll make a determination and the number of data points required, that can sometimes extend the amount of time that we give for the intervention to work in cases where it can't be implemented as faithfully as we would like. We should also specify whether we'll evaluate the intervention at a midpoint or at some point prior to making a determination about whether a special education referral is needed. Some districts choose to monitor progress and make a determination after 4 or 6 weeks to modify or intensify the intervention. And that should also be specified in advance if that's part of the educational plan for the student. It's also a good idea for a district or a school or a building team to have some discussion about what steps will be followed if the determination is that the student has made sufficient progress or insufficient progress or questionable progress. And there are different kinds of decisions that can be made based upon each of those determinations. But it's a good idea for schools to have those kinds of discussions in advance of implementing interventions for the student. So for example, if sufficient progress is made after 10 weeks, but the student has not fully closed the gap between themselves and their peers, is it appropriate then to discontinue the intervention, or will it be continued, or will it be continued with less frequency or intensity? If there's insufficient progress, will there be another intervention tried, or will the intervention be intensified first? Will there be more time allowed for the intervention to show progress? And so in those situations, we want to have those questions answered in advance as much as possible. Additionally, there are situations where the student makes more progress than they would have without intervention, but not as much as the goal would have them make. And so in those situations, will the time frame be extended, or will there be modifications to the intervention? Those kinds of things should be discussed in advance so that it helps the team to interpret the data and to make decisions based on the data in a way that's informed and that was considered in advance. In terms of analyzing the data, we'll have a few demonstrations or examples here in just a minute. Visual analysis is common for schools that are just starting out with RTI data. And it's a very common method of analyzing the data. And if you're using DIBELS, for example, they spit out graphs for you that compare the student's progress and their data points to the benchmark performance. The difficulty with visual analysis and why I wouldn't recommend it is that it doesn't provide any information about rate of improvement, and it can be misleading depending on how the information is graphed. And it's also difficult to interpret outliers or to have a plan for dealing with extreme data in situations where visual analysis is the method of choice. So we'll focus on measures that do give a rate of improvement number. One option that's common and very easy to calculate is a last data point minus first data point divided by the number of weeks. I actually think I have that backwards. I apologize on that PowerPoint. We'll fix that. The idea is that you take the very last, for example, oral reading fluency number and subtract it from the first number. So the outcome, the last data point divided by the or subtract it, excuse me, let me start over. The last data point that you collect, subtract the first data point that you collect, and then divide by the number of weeks of intervention. And that will give you a rate of progress or a rate of improvement, which is easy to calculate. The problem with that method is that typically at least the last data point is based upon only one oral reading fluency probe. And the method ignores all the data in the middle, so most of the data points are totally discounted. And that last data point can be pretty easily impacted by spurious data points. So if the student had a really good or a really bad day on that last date that the probe was administered, then that can really throw off the rate of improvement. Another method that's somewhat more reliable but more complicated is the split middle method, including a rate of improvement calculation. And I think that's easier to explain using a graph. The benefits of this method are that it does consider all the data points and addresses things like outliers, but it does require manual calculation and has a lack of empirical support. So we're not really sure how well this works or how reliable it is in terms of calculating the slope. We would also encourage the use of some additional metrics, or at least consideration of some additional measures to supplement the rate of improvement data. So for example, a discrepancy ratio can be calculated. I think these are particularly useful in situations where the student has made progress, but perhaps hasn't quite met the goal amount of progress, or has not quite met the amount of progress that would be preferred based on that ambitious goal we talked about before. So to calculate a discrepancy ratio, we'll also have examples of these in just a minute. You'll have an expected rate of improvement, which is based on your goal line, your ambitious goal, and then you divide it by the obtained rate of improvement. If your ratio is less than 1, the student is making progress faster than expected. And if the ratio is more than 2, then you would want to take another look at how the student is doing in terms of their progress. A ratio higher than 2 could be cause for concern. Another way of looking at this data could be the percent of expected growth. And we talked in terms of reasonable and ambitious goals that the student, that just maintaining the gap would be an indicator that the student is probably doing better than they would have done without any intervention. And so a percent of expected growth is just a way to quantify that. So you take the rate of improvement of the student and you divide it by the expected rate of improvement, which is based on the benchmark rather than the ambitious goal. So then we're comparing this student who's receiving intervention to a benchmark student, or a student at the 50th percentile if you're using AIMSWeb, so that we can see how much progress we would expect from a normative or a student at benchmark, and what percentage of that rate the student that we're working with has obtained. If we see a percent of 100% or greater, we consider that the student is doing about what we would expect or exceeding it. If they're not making 100% of at least the benchmark line or the benchmark rate of improvement, then we want to be a little bit concerned that they're possibly not responding to intervention in quite the way we would like. So these can be used as additional metrics. So now let's take an example. I think it's easier to look at visually. And so this is the first example that we gave of a way to calculate the data. The last minus first divided by weeks. And again, we'll fix that heading. I apologize. So we take the last data point here, which in this case is a 53, and we subtract the first data point, which was a 27. So that calculation is right over here, to 26. And then we take the number of weeks. So you can see down here the number of weeks are numbered. This happened to be at the midpoint, so this is week 15. And then we subtract 15, 0, because we started at week 0. So we have 15 weeks. So to calculate the rate of improvement, we would take 26, which is the total number of words gained, divided by 15, the number of weeks, and then we would get a rate of improvement calculation of 1.7. In comparison to the ambitious goal, which you can see up here was calculated at gaining 2 words correct per minute per week, we would determine that the student had made insufficient progress towards the ambitious goal. However, they are exceeding the normative goal of 1.5, so we'll look at that up here. Here's the discrepancy ratio, which we talked about as a supplemental measure. So we take the goal rate of progress, which is 2, taken from this ambitious goal line up here. 2, we divide it by the student's calculated rate of improvement, which was 1.7, and we come up with a number, an estimate of 1.18. Based on the recommendations that have been provided for interpreting that, we would interpret this as being close to the expected amount of progress and probably not a cause for concern. So the student is close to making as much progress as we would anticipate based upon the ambitious goal. If we look at percent of expected growth, this is where we compare the student's progress to the progress of the normative line. And so we would take the blue line rate, we would take the student's rate, 1.7, and divide it by the expected rate of the normative sample, which is 1.5, and we see that the student now is making progress that exceeds the amount of progress that would be made by a normative peer. So although the student is not meeting the ambitious goal of gaining 2 words per minute per week, they are gaining more than our normative line of 1.5 words per minute per week. So the decision there is sufficient progress. So this, I think, helps us to see that if we simply use the rate of improvement and compare it to the ambitious goal, our determination is that they really aren't making sufficient progress because they have not met their goal. However, if we look at some other metrics to kind of supplement, we can see that the student is both exceeding the amount of progress that we would expect for a student who's performing at an average or an acceptable or a benchmark level, and is close to making the progress that we would expect based upon their ambitious goal. So those numbers can kind of help us to conceptualize and think about, well, how far off the mark are they, and do we really need to be concerned about the amount of progress the student is making in terms of intervention? Here's an example of calculating the split middle method. What you do here is you take into consideration the total number of data points you have, and you draw a line straight down the middle. So in this case, we had 7 weeks, 8 weeks prior to intervention, and 8 weeks, 7 weeks at the beginning half and 7 weeks at the end half. Excuse me, 8. 8 weeks, sorry. I can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 8. So we draw a line between the first 8 data points and the second 8 data points. And then what we do is we calculate the median of these 8 data points. See if I can get a drawing utensil here. Oh, that's not what I want. Here we go. Apologies for the technology problems here. Okay, so we calculate the median of these 8 data points, and then we would calculate the median of these 8 data points. And so we can see up here that the first median is 31, and then the second median is 50. We also calculate the median number of weeks. So we had 7. Our last data point here was in week 7, and we subtract from week 0, which was baseline. So we had 7 divided in half, 3.5. Our median is between 3 and 4. And then up here, our median is between 11 and 12. So our median week up here was 11.5. So you can see the numbers all up here calculated for you. In order to calculate the split middle rate of improvement, we have to subtract, calculations all down here now, the second median minus the first median, which gives us 19. And then we have to subtract the weeks. So 11.5 minus 3.5, so we have 8. And then the rate of improvement calculation right here is 19 divided by 8, which is 2.0, which you can see then up here is exactly where we wanted the student to be in terms of the ambitious goal. So in this model, we would determine that the student is making sufficient progress in comparison to the goal line. Calculating the discrepancy ratio, in this example, we take 2.0 divided by 2.0, and we get 1.0, which means the student is exactly on track in comparison to what we wanted out of them as an ambitious goal. And in percent of expected progress, they're at 133% of what we expect the normative average benchmark student to be making. So they're exceeding our expectations in that regard and closing the gap between themselves and the benchmark. So in any case, in this model, we see that the student is making sufficient progress. And I think that by my example, you can even see the difficulty in calculating this statistic, and that it's a little bit demanding in terms of time and effort, and it does have to be manually calculated because there don't seem to be too many programs available that would help with that calculation. So it's pretty much a hand calculation, but it does provide that rate of improvement information. An Excel calculation of Trendline is probably the easiest and most reliable way to calculate rate of improvement. So when we look at Excel, we see that, well, when we look at the available literature, what we notice is that most people would suggest ordinary least squares regression as the method to calculate student rate of improvement. So a lot of researchers will use OLS regression to make that calculation. Excel, although their Trendline calculation does not use ordinary least squares, it does use a form of regression to calculate a linear trend line. So this lends a little bit of empirical support to our approach to calculating rate of improvement. And additionally, although it requires an extra step of data entry for those of you using Dibbles or MClass or AIMSWeb, it requires the extra step of entering the data into Excel, but it does provide a trend line that's reliable and that's consistent with the research that we have in terms of using that regression formula. It provides the slope calculation there, provides a best fit line or rate of improvement, and a metric for the goodness of fit, which we won't talk too much about today. But it does calculate that line for you. The pros are that there's pretty minimal hand calculation. This method accounts for all of the data points, and it provides an ROI estimate that's consistent with the research and that promotes consistency in decision making. So if we think about all the variability between measures and school districts and different policies, most people will have access to Excel, and with just a few simple steps of setup and a little bit of background knowledge of Excel and where to click and a little bit of understanding of basic statistics, you are able to get a calculation that could be implemented consistently across several schools or across the district. I think I'm going to come back to this in a minute if we have time for it. I'm sensitive to time here. So here's an example of the exact same data that we were working with before. And out here, on the very end, you can see the information that Excel spit out. So we asked Excel to calculate a trend line for this, the red line of student progress data, and what it gave us, this number right here, right before the X, is the calculated slope of the line or the rate of improvement. So in this model, the student is gaining 2.0368 words correct per minute per week, and in comparison to our ambitious goal of 2, we would determine that the student is making sufficient progress. And then we have similar calculations here of discrepancy ratio and percent of expected progress. So this can also help our decision making. And as you can see, I didn't do any hand calculation. I really just put it into Excel. And that's what it spit out for me, was a nice trend line and a slope, which is about as reliable an estimate as you can get. So let me just see if I can pop this in here and show you quickly. Okay. Are you able to see the Excel spreadsheet on your screen? I got a couple smiles. Thank you very much. Okay, so if I type information in here, you'll have to tell me if you can see it or not. So if we think about, this is just an Excel spreadsheet. All I have done is put the labels that I want on my graph legend down the side and the number of weeks across the top. If I type in the annual rate of improvement, what I'm going to type in is the fall benchmark, which in this example is 62, and the spring benchmark, which in this example is 106. Can you see those numbers? All right, thank you. Then we'll type in our goal, which in this case, for an ambitious goal of 2 words per minute per week gained, would be 27, which we'll use as the student starting point. And then we basically add 2 words correct per minute per week. So if you wanted to do it, you could go across like this. We're not going to do all of that. I've done the calculation already. It would be 87. And then when you do progress monitoring, you simply type in, for if we collect data every week, then you simply type in the data. Like that. In order to get a graph, oh, I don't know if it's, there we go. Click on Insert, Line, and it gives me nothing, so I did this on purpose. So you go down to Format Chart Area, nope, excuse me. Click on Select Data, click on this button, highlight your table, and then click on this button again. And that now you can see that it started to graph some data. Click on Hidden and Empty Cells, and then Show Data in Hidden Rows and Columns. And for this one, actually we don't need that. Click on Connect Data Points with a Line, and then click OK. And then click OK again, and then it shows you the graph. If you want this in a separate spreadsheet tab on the bottom, then you just click Move Chart, and you can click it out to its own separate tab on your Excel. So you just click on the chart, OK, and there you have it. If you right-click on this line, you can go down to Add Trendline. We want linear, and you're going to put down here at the bottom display equation on the chart. And then you click Close, and then it will put this line right here for this line of progress. So this student, the goal was 2 words correct per minute per week, and their slope of progress is 1.57. So they're actually falling off the goal, but they're making about as much progress as expected in comparison to the benchmark. So this would be a little bit different example that you could use. So that's just a quick example. I'm sensitive to time again, and we're going to have to stop and turn it back over to Ginger in just a second. But that's an example of how you would calculate the trend line for those of you who are unfamiliar. So in conclusion, again, just to reemphasize, we want to use caution when deciding whether to use response or rate of improvement and SLD determinations or evaluations, because again, it's only a piece of the puzzle, and as hopefully you can see from the presentation today, there's a lot of variability in terms of how rate of progress is calculated, how decisions are being made, how goals are being set with regard to rate of improvement or student progress. And so we then need to use caution in making decisions as important as an SLD determination. We also want to talk about goals, timelines, number of data points, and decision rules in advance of implementing the intervention if we feel that rate of improvement data will be used in the SLD decision. And when we analyze the data, we want to include some measure of rate of improvement and a comparison of the student's rate of improvement to a normative sample. So we want to take into account, is the student meeting our goal, and is the student making progress similar to what we would expect of a normative student or student at the average or at the benchmark. And this can help us both to analyze whether the student has met the goal and whether their amount of progress, if they haven't met the goal, is comparable to what we would expect from students who are not at risk. So given the limitations to both the quantity of measures that we have available and their quality, we want to just be cautious in our use of these data for high-stakes decisions and also consider supplemental measures and incorporate those into our SLD determinations. And at this point, I thank you so much for joining us today. And there's some references for you. Here's contact information, and at this point I'm going to turn it back over to Ginger for some final comments. Thank you all very much.
Okay, and thank you, Dr. Ball, for such a great webinar on using student rate of improvement data for SLD evaluation and eligibility determination. In about a week, this webinar will be up on the EERC website as well as the PowerPoint slides, and I'll check with Dr. Ball if we can get that Excel example maybe to put up, or directions as far as how to set that up and answer to your question, Loretta. So thank you for participating today. We really appreciate you joining our webinar, and thanks for the clapping for Dr. Ball. That's awesome. One thing we would like to ask you is to take a moment to complete our feedback before you log out. And the way you do this is if you look in the chat box, there is a link, and when you click on that, that will take you out of our session, and we are finished. And then there's just a few questions that you'll be asked to answer before you log out. So if you don't mind doing that, we would appreciate it. We really do look at that feedback and set up our webinars based on the feedback we receive from you. So just take a moment and click on that link and fill out our feedback. And if you have any other questions, feel free to email Dr. Ball or the EERC contact on our website. So thank you very much.